It is different days, even though some of us remember them well. Yeah, because the powerful unions then are nowhere nearly as powerful now, and they don't have the membership. However, as we've seen with what Mick Lynch is saying, you know, if we call off the strike, we'll never get a settlement. They are saying they still have to have this industrial push to get things achieved, they say.
The numbers are interesting on this, Mark. Back in the day, in the late 1970s, and we remember as kids, don't we, the power cuts.
3-day week.
Could have them again now. We remember the industrial action always featuring on television news. I don't know about you, that's when I really became interested in news, when I saw the sort of economic fallout from politics and so on. Back then, as you rightly say, just over half the British workforce was unionised. There was a lot more nationalised industries and so on. And now it's about 25% of the workforce is unionised. But in the public sector, it is about 50%. And the public sector unions are, at the moment, increasingly militant, increasingly likely to go for strike action. We're hearing about nurses striking. Yep. We've got university lecturers striking today, tomorrow and Wednesday. The RMT, they're a private sector union, but our railways are a kind of semi-public, semi-private...
Yes, British Rail in those days.
Hybrid, aren't they? Because people expect... You know, you just talked to Catherine about holding the government to account. People kind of expect the government to step in, even though we're talking about private rail operators. So there is still a high degree of unionisation. And when you get...
public sector, yeah.
When you get high inflation, and we've obviously got inflation at a 41-year high, that is similar to the 70s. In some senses, inflation now is worse than in the 70s under some definitions. Then you get pay lagging inflation, then you get real wage constriction, then unions start getting militant. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and that's the parallel, of course, with the 1970s, that we've not seen this inflation for many decades. But the other aspect, and we were speaking to Andy Fury about this with the Communication Workers Union, is that we've got these public bodies, or at least public services, but they are privately owned now, effectively. So the Royal Mail basically is trying to be a commercial operation, but it's in a situation where it was still doing the job it was in the 1970s.
This was always the issue, wasn't it? And you know, again, this goes back to the debates we were having in the 70s and the 80s. When you privatise these essentially public goods, these public services, you know, like the railways, they're basically a natural monopoly, as we say in economics. Like the postal service, in some senses, it's not as much of a monopoly as it was back then, because we've got the internet, we've got a lot more private sector postal services. You know, you've got the whole network of Amazon and the tech retail giants. They don't use Royal Mail.
Yeah.
So Royal Mail is being challenged. But it is really, really difficult. And I think a real parallel with the 70s, we've had an energy price shock, just as we had energy price shocks in the 70s. You know, talk about energy security and geopolitical strife, just like we had in the 70s. We've got that again now. But I think we understate the extent to which it's similar to the 70s, because a lot of people, rightly, like you just did, say, oh, but the unions aren't as serious as they were back then. No, they're not. But where they are serious, they're serious.
Yeah.
And I do think we're going to see more public sector strikes in the weeks and months ahead.
And where does this leave the government? And, I mean, the phrase, remember the 1970s, crisis, what crisis? Well, Jim Cameron never actually said that.
He never actually said that.
But the government's indicating that the Treasury is really saying, look, you just cannot agree to these price or the pay rises because of the price inflation that brings through the system.
So the nurses want 17%. I mean, way above inflation, but they would say we haven't had a decent pay rise for a long time. Public sector workers, you know, may well get, you know, inflation-linked settlements. I mean, we've just had inflation-linked settlement on the basic state pension, right? That cost 11 billion quid. But because you've got this contrast at the moment between a public sector which is heavily unionised and a private sector that isn't heavily unionised, in a way it could become even more fractious than it did in the 70s. I don't wish to be alarmist or catastrophist. It just strikes me that there is that real schism now between the public and the private sector. So whereas in the past, and I remember this, listening to conversations in what we used to call working men's clubs back in the 70s, you'd get private sector workers, they would support the public sector workers. They'd often strike in sympathy, wouldn't they, when laws allowed that kind of sympathy.
Secondary picketing,
all of that stuff. Yeah. I don't think you're going to get that now. The public sector unions will strike, and there will be some buy-in from some members of the public for a while, but I think the 4/5 of the workforce in the private sector, 4/5 compared to a fifth in the public sector, I think they'll be less patient with the public sector strikers. And that's why I wonder that politics could yet become a lot more fractious as you get more public sector strikes in the weeks and months ahead.
And those people who aren't union members can't get to work on the trains to...
That's right.